In a drab courtroom, a uniformed officer swaggered and kicked a civilian in a hoodie, believing he was an easy target. He had no idea he had just assaulted the man who would dismantle his entire world. The air in courtroom 3B was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cheap disinfectant, and quiet desperation. It's a scent I've come to know well over the years, the perfume of the justice system at its most granular level. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the back row, my shoulders slumped forward, hands tucked into the pocket of my worn gray hoodie. To anyone who bothered to look, I was just another face in the gallery, another concerned family member, maybe a friend of the accused, blending into the worn-out tapestry of civic anxiety. That was the point. Today I wasn't Director Thorne. I was just Marcus, here to watch the arraignment of my late partner's son, Leo, a good kid who'd made a stupid mistake with a spray can. My focus should have been on the proceedings, on the tired-looking public defender and the overworked judge, but my attention kept getting snagged by him. Officer Miller. He wasn't one of the bailiffs assigned to the courtroom. He looked like a patrolman, probably the arresting officer for one of the upcoming cases. He stood by the side wall, arms crossed over a chest that strained the buttons of his uniform shirt. He had a particular way of scanning the room, a predator's gaze that didn't seek threats, but targets. It lingered on the brown and black faces, gliding right over the white ones. When his eyes met mine, they narrowed. I saw a flicker of something ugly in them, a mix of suspicion and contempt. I gave him nothing back, just a neutral, tired expression, and let my gaze drift back to the judge. But Miller was a dog with a bone. I could feel his stare burning into the side of my head. Out of my periphery, I saw him mutter something to one of the bailiffs, who just shrugged. A few minutes later, Miller began a slow, deliberate patrol along the back of the courtroom. His boots made heavy, authoritative thuds on the linoleum floor. He passed behind my bench, his footsteps pausing for just a beat too long. I could smell the cheap, spicy cologne he was wearing. He was trying to intimidate me, to get a reaction. I just kept my eyes forward, my breathing even. I faced down cartel enforcers and terrorist leaders. A puffed-up beat cop with an ego problem was background noise. The judge called a 10-minute recess. As people began to stand, stretch, and file out into the hallway for a cigarette or a hushed phone call, I stayed put. Leo's case was next, and I didn't want to miss it. The room emptied out, leaving only a handful of us scattered on the benches. This was the opening Miller had been waiting for. He sauntered over, his thumbs hooked into his duty belt. He stopped right in front of me, planting his polished boots wide, forcing me to look up at him. "You got business here?" he asked. His voice was a low growl, laced with an arrogance that set my teeth on edge. I kept my own voice level, quiet. "Just observing, officer." "Observing," he repeated, drawing the word out like it was a lie. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice even lower. "You look a little out of place. We've had some problems with observers trying to intimidate witnesses." He let the accusation hang in the air. I didn't take the bait. "I'm just here to support a family friend." A smirk played on his lips. It was a nasty, condescending thing. "A family friend," he sneered. "Right. Listen, pal, I don't like your vibe. Why don't you go support him from the hallway? You're making the room uncomfortable." He was talking about himself, of course. My presence, my calmness, my refusal to cower it, was making him uncomfortable. He saw a black man in a hoodie who wasn't showing him the deference he believed he was owed, and his programming couldn't compute it. I sighed internally, a deep, weary breath that I didn't let show on my face. "With all due respect, officer, this is a public courtroom. I have every right to be here." The smirk vanished. His face hardened into a mask of pure fury. The thin veneer of professional authority cracked, revealing the raw bigotry underneath. "You got a smart mouth on you, don't you? Think you're a lawyer?" He jabbed a thick finger toward my chest. I said, "Get out." I made a calculated decision. Escalating here would cause a scene, and the last thing Leo needed was more trouble. I slowly, deliberately began to stand up. I wasn't going to be chased out, but I would move to the hallway to de-escalate. But my slowness, my lack of frantic, fearful obedience, was the final insult. "I gave you an order," he barked, his voice echoing in the nearly empty room. As I straightened my legs, turning to walk toward the aisle, his rage boiled over. He took a half-step forward and shoved me hard in the shoulder. I stumbled, catching my balance against the back of the bench in front of me. The wood dug into my palms. I turned my head to look at him, my eyes cold, analytical, cataloging every detail of this moment for a report I knew I'd be filing later. Seeing the lack of fear in my eyes seemed to break something in him. His face contorted, a snarl twisting his lips. "You people think you can just defy the law," he spat, the venom thick in his words. And then he did it. As I stood there, off balance, he swung his leg back. It wasn't a powerful martial arts kick. It was a cheap shot, a demeaning, contemptuous kick, to the back of my thigh, right above the knee, designed to buckle my leg and send me sprawling to the floor like a dog. Pain shot up my leg, sharp and biting. My knee gave way, and I pitched forward. Time seemed to slow down. I could hear the sound of the heavy courtroom doors swinging open behind us, the bailiff announcing the judge's return. I could hear Miller's low, triumphant chuckle, and as my hands hit the dusty, cold floor to break my fall, the last thing I saw before I looked up was the seal of the great state on the carpet, a symbol of a justice I was beginning to realize was completely, utterly blind. The cold shock of the floor jolted through my palms. For a split second, the world was a collection of sounds. The squeak of the bailiff's shoes, the rustle of papers on the prosecutor's table, and the sharp, indrawn breath of Leo from the defendant's box. My partner's son. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. This was supposed to be a simple, humbling lesson for him about consequences. Now it was becoming something else entirely. I pushed myself up onto one knee, my thigh screaming in protest. The kick had been perfectly placed to cause maximum pain and imbalance without necessarily breaking a bone. It was a practiced move, a bully's move. Miller stood over me, a mask of brutal satisfaction on his face. He had his audience now. "On the ground, face down now," he bellowed, his hand going to the handcuffs on his belt. From the bench, the judge, a stern-faced man named Albright, whom I knew only by reputation, rapped his gavel. "Officer, what is the meaning of this? This is my courtroom." "Resisting arrest, Your Honor," Miller called out, not even glancing at the judge. His entire focus was on me, on completing his domination. Suspect was causing a disturbance, became aggressive when I asked him to step outside. It was a lie so blatant, so textbook. It was almost elegant in its simplicity. I stayed on one knee, slowly raising my hands to show they were empty. My mind was a whirlwind of protocols and procedures. I was running threat assessments, calculating response trees, and simultaneously feeling a white-hot, diamond-hard rage I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about every person who had ever been in this position, without a badge and a top-level security clearance in their back pocket. "Officer," I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the murmurs in the room, "you are making a grave error." "Oh, I'm making an error?" he sneered, grabbing my left arm and twisting it violently behind my back. Pain flared in my shoulder socket. "The only error was you not getting out when I told you to." He snapped one cuff on my wrist. The cold metal bit into my skin. "Bailiff, assist the officer," Judge Albright commanded, his patience clearly gone. He just wanted the disruption handled. He saw a cop, and he saw a problem. The equation was simple for him. One of the bailiffs, a heavy-set man who had looked bored 5 minutes ago, moved forward hesitantly. He clearly hadn't seen what happened, but he had his orders. As Miller wrenched my other arm back, I spoke again, this time directly to the bench. "Your Honor, for the record," I stated, my voice ringing with a calm authority that seemed to momentarily surprise everyone, including Miller. "I have been assaulted by this officer without provocation. My name is Marcus Thorne. I am a citizen here to observe these proceedings, and I demand that this officer's name and badge number be entered into the court record immediately." Miller grunted, as if my words were a physical annoyance. He cinched the second cuff on. "You can demand whatever you want, you piece of—" "Officer Miller," the judge's voice boomed, cutting him off. The use of his name showed that the judge was at least paying attention now. "That's enough. Get him out of my courtroom. We'll sort this out later." "With pleasure, Your Honor," Miller growled into my ear. He hauled me to my feet, yanking my cuffed arms upward, forcing me to arch my back. The humiliation was the point. He wanted to parade me out, a trophy. "Let's go, Marcus Thorne," he mocked. "Time to see a different kind of room." He started to shove me toward the side door, the one that led to the holding cells. My mind raced. This had gone too far. It was one thing to be a passive observer, but being processed, fingerprinted, and thrown in a cell, that would trigger a cascade of notifications that would turn this local courthouse into a federal circus. I had to stop it here, but without revealing my hand. As we reached the door, I planted my feet. It was a subtle shift of weight, but my center of gravity was now rock solid. Miller shoved again, but this time I didn't budge. It was like he'd pushed against a concrete pillar. "Move," he snarled, shoving again, harder. I didn't move an inch. His face turned crimson with rage and confusion. How was this man in a hoodie, who he'd just kicked to the floor, suddenly so immovable? He was losing control of the situation, of the narrative, in front of the whole court. It was in that moment of frozen tension, that silent battle of wills, that the main courtroom doors at the back swung open with a decisive swoosh. A woman stood there. She was in a sharp, dark gray pantsuit, an earpiece discreetly tucked into one ear. Her eyes, the color of cold steel, scanned the scene in a fraction of a second. Me in cuffs, Miller's hand on my back, the judge on the bench, the stunned onlookers. She held a simple leather portfolio in one hand, and an air of absolute, unshakable authority. She took 3 purposeful steps into the room. Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "Officer," she said, her gaze locking onto Miller. "Take your hands off the director." Miller froze, his hand still on my back. He blinked, uncomprehending. "The what? Who the hell are you?" The woman's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief that someone could be this ignorant. She ignored his question and addressed the bailiff standing nearby. "Bailiff, uncuff Director Thorne and place that officer in custody. Now." That is a direct order from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words, Federal Bureau of Investigation, hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. The entire courtroom went from stunned silence to a low electric hum of whispers. The bailiff, who had been moving to assist Miller, stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from the woman in the suit, Agent Eva Rostova, my second-in-command, to Officer Miller, and then to me. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Miller, however, wasn't confused. He was enraged. He seemed to view Rostova's arrival not as a warning, but as a direct challenge to his authority in this tiny kingdom he'd built for himself. He actually laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of any humor. "You've got to be kidding me." "The director?" he sneered, giving my cuffed arms another vicious yank. "This bum? Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you just walked into a courtroom and tried to interfere with a lawful arrest. You're lucky I don't slap a pair of cuffs on you, too." Rostova didn't even blink. She took another step forward, her steely gaze never leaving Miller's face. "Your name is Officer Brian Miller, badge number 734. You've been on the force for 6 years, with 17 civilian complaints filed against you, 12 of them for excessive force and racial profiling. All of them were dismissed after an internal review. You are currently making the single biggest mistake of your career. For the last time, officer, release him." Every detail she recited was a hammer blow to Miller's composure. His face paled, the sneer faltering. He knew she wasn't bluffing. No one just walks into a courtroom with that kind of specific, damaging information. The knowledge was power, and she was wielding it with deadly precision. But his pride, his deeply ingrained sense of dominance, wouldn't let him back down. It was a cornered animal's response. "You can't come in here and—" he started to bluster. "Judge Albright," Rostova said, finally turning her attention to the bench. Her tone shifted from icy command to professional courtesy, but with a hard edge underneath. "My name is Special Agent in Charge Eva Rostova from the FBI's Washington Field Office. The man your officer has just assaulted and unlawfully detained is Director Marcus Thorne of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. You could physically see the reality of the situation crash down on Judge Albright. His face went slack with shock, his eyes darting between me, still in cuffs, and Rostova, standing ramrod straight in the center of the room. The scales of justice in his mind were recalibrating at lightning speed. A moment ago, this was a simple case of a disorderly citizen being removed by a cop. Now it was a local police officer assaulting the head of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, in his own courtroom. "Director Thorne," the judge stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. Not at the hoodie, not at my skin color, but at the man. He saw the stillness, the quiet confidence that Miller had mistaken for defiance. He saw the cold, intelligent fury in my eyes, and he finally understood. "Release him," Judge Albright commanded, his voice now a thunderous roar that shook the room. "Bailiff, release that man this instant." The bailiff, spurred into action by a direct order from the judge he actually recognized, scurried forward. He fumbled with his key, his hands shaking as he unlocked my cuffs. The metal sprang free from my wrists, leaving angry red marks behind. I slowly brought my hands in front of me, rubbing the circulation back into them, never taking my eyes off Miller. And Miller, he was imploding. The blood had drained from his face, leaving a pasty, grayish pallor. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He finally got it. He hadn't just kicked some random guy. He had, in front of numerous witnesses and a sitting judge, physically assaulted the director of the FBI. It was a career-ending, life-altering act of spectacular stupidity. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, an escape from the consequences that were descending upon him like an avalanche. "Judge, he resisted," Miller stammered, his voice cracking. The lie sounded pathetic now, even to his own ears. "Be quiet, Officer Miller," the judge snapped, his face a thundercloud of judicial wrath. He knew exactly how bad this made him, his court, and the entire local department look. I took a step toward Miller. He flinched back, as if expecting me to strike him. But that wasn't my way. I stopped a foot in front of him. My voice was low, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more chilling. "Your firearm, officer," I said. It wasn't a question. He just stared at me, his mind clearly not processing the command. "Give Agent Rostova your service weapon and your badge. Now." Slowly, like a man in a trance, his trembling hands went to his holster. He unclipped his Glock and held it out butt first toward Rostova, who took it with practiced efficiency. Then he fumbled with the badge on his chest, his fingers clumsy and useless. Finally it came free, and he held it out. The small piece of metal, the symbol of all his power and authority, looked like a cheap toy in his shaking palm. I looked from the badge to his terrified eyes. The room was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do, what I would say. They expected me to yell, to deliver some grand speech about justice. But I had only one question for him. "Officer Miller," I began, my voice a quiet blade. "Before Agent Rostova interrupted us, you were escorting me to a holding cell. I'd still like to see it." "Art." A wave of confusion washed over his face, replacing the fear for just a second. "Sir?" I turned my head slightly, looking back towards the side door he'd been shoving me through just moments before. I gave him a cold, empty smile. "I want you to personally give me a tour of where you keep your prisoners, and then I want you to show me exactly how the door locks from the outside." Miller looked like I had just asked him to explain the theory of relativity in a dead language. His mind, already reeling from the catastrophic collapse of his world, simply couldn't process the request. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. No sound coming out. "Did you not hear the director?" Agent Rostova's voice was like a crack of ice behind him. "He wants a tour." The bailiff, now desperate to be on the right side of this unfolding disaster, quickly stepped forward and pulled open the heavy side door. "Right this way, sir. Holding is just down the hall." I didn't move. I kept my eyes locked on Miller. "No," I said calmly. "I want him to show me." The silent command was absolute. Miller, stripped of his gun, his badge, and his swagger, was now just a man in a costume. A terrified man. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet courtroom. With a jerky, robotic motion, he turned and shuffled through the doorway. I followed him, with Rostova falling into step right behind me, a silent, imposing shadow. The heavy door clicked shut, muffling the chaotic buzz of the courtroom we left behind. We were in a narrow cinder-block corridor painted a nauseating shade of institutional beige. The air was colder here, and it smelled of sweat and despair. Miller walked ahead of me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. It was a walk I'd seen 1,000 times, the walk of a man who knows the game is over and he has lost completely. We passed 2 empty cells before he stopped in front of the third one. The door was solid steel with a small barred window at eye level. "This is it," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. This is the holding cell." "Open it," I commanded. He fumbled with the large key attached to his belt loop, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to get it into the lock. The lock gave a heavy, grating clunk as it turned. He pulled the massive door open, revealing a small, bleak concrete box. There was a single metal slab for a bench and a toilet sink combination in the corner. Nothing else. "And the lock?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Show me how it works from the outside." He looked at me, a flicker of something, maybe defiance, maybe just sheer panic in his eyes. But it died as quickly as it came. He stepped back out of the cell and pushed the heavy door. It swung shut with a deafening clang that echoed down the hallway. He pointed a trembling finger at the lock mechanism. You turn the key. It locks. That's all. I nodded slowly, taking it all in. I looked at the steel door, the concrete walls, the utter lack of humanity in the space. I thought about how many people he had thrown in here, people without my resources, without an Agent Rostova to sweep in and save them, people who were just trying to get through their day when they had the misfortune of crossing paths with a man like Brian Miller. I turned my full attention back to him. He shrank under my gaze. "You know, officer," I began, "I came here today for one reason, to support the son of a fallen colleague, a good man who died in the line of duty. His son, Leo, made a mistake. He's a kid who needs to learn about accountability, about how your actions have consequences." I took a step closer, invading his personal space. He tried to back away, but his back hit the cinderblock wall. He was trapped. "You seem to have missed that lesson somewhere along the way, Officer Miller," I continued, my voice a low growl. "You believe that this uniform, that badge you carried, placed you above consequences, that it gave you the right to be judge, jury, and punisher." I tapped my thigh where the dull ache of his kick still lingered. "You thought I was just some guy in a hoodie. Nameless, voiceless, easy to push around, easy to discard into a cell like this one." His breathing was shallow, ragged. He was starting to sweat, beads of perspiration popping up on his forehead. "So we're going to have a little lesson in accountability, right here, right now." I turned to Agent Rostova. "Eva, I want a full federal investigation opened into Officer Brian Miller and the Metropolis Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. I want every single one of those 17 complaints he had filed against him pulled, re-examined, and every single complainant re-interviewed. I want to know who buried them and why. Subpoena everything. Phone records, internal memos, the works. I want to know how deep this rot goes." "Consider it done, Director," Rostova said, already tapping a message into her phone. I turned back to the trembling wreck that was once Officer Miller. "You're going to be the start of it, Brian. You are going to be the poster child for what happens when a broken system is finally held accountable." I reached out and took the cell key from his nerveless fingers. Then I stepped back and gestured towards the open cell door with my head. "After you." He stared at me, uncomprehending. "What?" "You heard me," I said, my voice flat and cold as the concrete floor. "Get in the cell." "You can't do this," he squeaked, a desperate, pleading edge to his voice. "I have rights. You can't just lock me up." "Can't I?" I let the question hang in the air for a long moment. "You assaulted a federal officer, in a courthouse, in front of a judge. Believe me, locking you in this cell is the most pleasant thing that's going to happen to you for a very, very long time. Now, for the last time, get in the cell." Defeated, his last spark of resistance extinguished, he stumbled into the small concrete box. He turned to face me, his eyes wide with terror as he finally understood his new reality. I looked at him through the small barred window, the same way he had looked at countless others. I put the key in the lock. "One more thing, Miller," I said, my hand on the key. "That family friend I was here to support. His name is Leo Martinez. His father was Detective Carlos Martinez. Maybe you remember him. He was killed during a botched raid 5 years ago. A raid that went bad because an overzealous patrolman didn't wait for backup, went in half-cocked, and got a good man killed." I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the dawning horror as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. His face went white as a sheet. "You were that patrolman," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You got my partner killed, and you just kicked his friend, the director of the FBI, in his son's arraignment." I turned the key. The lock slammed shut with a final, deafening clang. The echo of the lock engaging seemed to suck all the air out of the narrow hallway. Through the small, barred window, I watched Brian Miller's face crumple. It wasn't just the fear of being locked up anymore. It was the crushing weight of his entire history, colliding with his present. He staggered back until he hit the concrete wall, sliding down to sit on the cold metal bench. The man who had strode into that courtroom with the arrogance of a king was now just a broken shell in a box he had built for himself, one bad decision at a time. I turned away from the door, the heavy key feeling like a dead weight in my hand. I tossed it to the bailiff, who was still standing by, looking pale and shaken. "See that he's transferred to federal custody as soon as the marshals arrive. He is not to be left alone with any local officers. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "Absolutely clear, Director," the bailiff stammered, fumbling the key. I walked back towards the courtroom with Agent Rostova at my side. "Ava," I said, keeping my voice low, I need you to handle the press on this. No grandstanding. The official line is that an incident occurred involving a federal officer, and it is now under investigation. Frame it as a matter of inter-agency cooperation to root out misconduct. We are helping them clean their house, not burning it down. Understood, Marcus, she replied, her professional demeanor firmly back in place. And Leo? I'll handle Leo, I said, as I pushed the courtroom door open. The room was in a state of controlled chaos. A few more bailiffs had appeared, and a well-dressed man I recognized as the district attorney was in a hushed, frantic conversation with Judge Albright. When I walked back in, a new kind of silence fell. Every eye was on me. I ignored them all, my gaze fixed on the defendant's box where Leo was still sitting, looking utterly bewildered. I walked straight to the prosecutor's table. The young assistant DA looked up at me, his eyes wide. Director Thorne, we had no idea. I'm sure you didn't, I cut him off, but without malice. What are the charges against Leo Martinez? Vandalism, sir. Defacing public property. It's a misdemeanor. I looked over at Leo, who flinched under my gaze. He was a good kid who'd been running with a new crowd, trying to find his footing after losing his dad. The graffiti had been stupid, a cry for attention more than anything else, but Carlos, my late partner, had made me promise to look out for him. I have a proposal, Mr. District Attorney, I said, turning to the senior man who had now approached the table. You drop the charges against Leo Martinez. In exchange, he will complete 200 hours of community service, personally cleaning up not just his own graffiti, but any other vandalism in that district. He will also enroll in a mentorship program I will personally oversee. I paused, letting the offer sink in. And the Metropolis Police Department will issue a formal public apology for the unprovoked assault on a citizen in this courthouse. Not to me as the director of the FBI, but to Marcus Thorne, concerned citizen. The DA didn't hesitate. It was the best deal he was going to get all decade. A chance to avoid a $1 billion federal lawsuit and the complete evisceration of his local police force in the national media. That seems more than fair, Director. We accept. Judge Albright, eager to put this entire fiasco behind him, banged his gavel. Case dismissed. The terms of the agreement will be entered into the record. This court is adjourned. As people began to file out, buzzing with the story they would be telling for the rest of their lives, I walked over to Leo. He stood up as I approached, his head bowed. I'm sorry, Marcus, he whispered, his voice thick with shame. I caused all this. I put a hand on his shoulder, the same way his father used to do with me after a tough case. No, you didn't, Leo. You made a mistake, and you were ready to face the music for it. What happened in here today had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with a man who forgot what that badge was supposed to stand for. I squeezed his shoulder gently. Your father, he was the best of them. He believed in justice, in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. The community service, the mentorship, that's you honoring his memory. That's you facing the consequences. I'm proud of you. Tears welled in his eyes, but he nodded, standing a little taller. For the first time all day, I saw a flicker of the man he was going to become, the man Carlos would have been proud of. As we walked out into the main hallway, past stunned police officers and courthouse employees who were staring at me with a mixture of awe and terror, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. It wasn't a victory. There was no joy in ruining a man's life, even a man like Miller. But it was a necessary rebalancing of the scales. For years, Miller had operated with impunity, protected by a system that was designed to look the other way. He had gotten my partner killed through his recklessness and had never faced a single consequence. Today, that ended. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Rostova. First pass on Miller's file is ugly. Looks like he was the focal point of a whole crew of bad apples. This is going to be big. I knew it would be. This wasn't just about one racist cop having a bad day anymore. It was about pulling on a single thread and watching a corrupt tapestry unravel. Miller in his cell wasn't the end. He was the beginning. He was the key. We would use him to expose every other officer he worked with, every supervisor who covered for him, every internal affairs investigator who buried his complaints. Standing on the courthouse steps, blinking in the bright afternoon sun, I took a deep breath. The air no longer smelled of stale coffee and desperation. It smelled of possibility. Justice, I knew, wasn't a place or a building. It was a process, and sometimes that process starts in the back row of a forgotten courtroom, with a quiet man in a gray hoodie who refuses to be kicked down.